is the director of the Field Center for FSHD Research at the University of Rochester Medical Center up in Rochester, New York. Many of you know it as one of the foremost FSHD research centers in the world. Dr. Tawil is a true pioneer who has dedicated himself to FSH muscular dystrophy for many decades. And I think it's fair to say that his work has contributed disproportionately to the success of our field today and having clinical trials and looking forward to the prospect of more clinical trials. So we're very, very honored to have him here today. And with that, Dr. Tawil, I'll turn over the microphone to you, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, June. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think this is a good time to talk about clinical trials that are often, you know, we talk among each other a lot about clinical trials, but I think there's perhaps a lot of questions that patients and individuals interested in getting into clinical trials have about how a clinical trial works, how it's designed, what are the steps from early research, preclinical research, to clinical research, and then to a clinical trial and drug approval. So we're going to touch on all of these topics today. Okay, so just wanted to go over kind of what we call the translational pathway. So from the beginning of research on a particular condition all the way to human clinical trials. If it's a genetic disease, as we're dealing with FSH, you have to kind of figure out what's going on with the gene and how the gene is affecting a particular tissue that's involved, muscle in this case. And then there's a process of trying to figure out how you can eliminate the effect of the mutation in a particular gene. In the case of FSH muscular dystrophy, most of you know that it's a turning on of a gene that's not supposed to be turned on in muscle, and that's a DUX4 gene. And once you kind of figure out what that DUX4 does, then you can go after targeted treatment. You can screen drugs or drugs that are already available, or you can screen chemicals that you think may have an effect on DUX4, or any other genetic approaches as is being done recently. And then there's a period of drug development, and then you go into human clinical trials. In the case of the first clinical trial that we've seen, what we call targeted clinical trial in FSH, the Fulcrum study, they are using a drug that's already been trialed in other diseases. So they were able to go from screening of the drug in a fairly short period of time into clinical trials. If you're using a new drug, then obviously the drug development period is longer before you go into clinical trials. And in parallel with what the scientists are doing in the lab, there is a lot of important information that we have to collect as clinical researchers to understand the disease itself. What are the clinical features? What's the natural history? Do different people with different characteristics evolve differently or progress differently? Does it have to do with any particular the genetic mutation that they have, or does it have to do with gender? And we look at all of the characteristics that may affect progression, because this is a way for us to kind of stratify patients according to those characteristics, and that helps us design a clinical trial. But the most important thing is actually of trial preparedness is actually trying to kind of figure out what are the best ways to measure progression in somebody with FSH muscular dystrophy. There are direct ways of doing that, which is measuring muscle strength or muscle function. And the FDA is more interested nowadays in functional outcome measures, which are measures that actually measure your functional capabilities before and after treatment. But there are also biomarkers that are very important. Biomarkers are any blood test or any other kind of quantitative test, like an MRI, for example, or the electrical impedance myography, which is some of you maybe who have been involved in some of the studies that we're doing know about. These are biomarkers that may help us in early phase studies to detect improvement before we can measure improvement in strength. But the other also major input in any clinical trial is what the patients feel. So patient-reported outcome measures are very important because the FDA wants to know that the intervention is actually making, has an impact on the daily life of somebody with FSH. So, and just wanted to kind of point to the fact that as we're talking, and some of you may be involved with the RESOLVE study, which started back in 2016. And this is a collaborative study that I'm doing with Jeff Statland at KUMC in Kansas City. And we first, before we were able to get NIH funding for this study, we put together a network of sites, trained evaluators, and this was done with the help of various funders, including the FSH Society. And at this point, we have 8 sites in the US, 3 sites in Europe, and we're going to add an additional 2 or 3 sites in Europe. And what we're hoping that this will provide us is with really a comprehensive look at what happens with a large group of patients with FSH over a span of 18 months. And this will allow us also to kind of what we call validate some of the outcome measures that we're going to be measuring in patients over that time period. And this is very important before we get into clinical trials. And some of that work has been done in the past. In a first natural history study, we know that there are certain things that we can use for outcome measures, but we're always trying to improve on those. So why do we need clinical trials? If something is going to make you better, shouldn't it be obvious? Well, yes, but you have to prove that. You have to prove that the treatment works. You have to prove that it is better than any existing treatment. This is not the case in FSH yet, but it may be at some point when we have multiple treatments that are effective. And very important, is the treatment safe? And the best way to do that, the most objective way of doing that is in the randomized controlled clinical trials. And this is really the best way to prove that something, any type of intervention is effective. And this is, and so the randomized trial means that some patients will be on active drug and some patients will be on a placebo control. And the reason this is important, especially in something like a slowly progressive condition like FSH muscular dystrophy, is that it's difficult to measure changes over a short period of time. So you all know that things happen over time, but in most instances, in most patients with FSH, that happens over years. We need to be able to do that in a shorter period of time. And to do that, you have to have a control group. So you compare somebody with FSH to somebody who's not somebody who's has FSH on an active drug versus a control placebo drug, and in this situation, you can measure small changes that will suggest early on, before even the patients notice, perhaps that things are improving. And and again, this is assuming that the drug that we're trialing is going to slow down progression, but we don't know that. It may actually make patients stronger, and maybe make patients stronger over a shorter period of time than we expect. And this is one of the questions that often comes up, and I'm asked is, in any clinical trial, what is the drug going to do for me? Is it going to stop the progression, slow progression, stop the progression and make me stronger, or stop the progression and allow me to get back to a completely normal strength in all of my muscles? And so those are the things that we don't know going into the study. All of those are possible, but in designing a clinical trial, we want to make sure that if there's a small change that's relevant, we need to capture that. That's why we need these controlled trials. So what are the components of a clinical trial? A clinical trial is an intensely regulated study, and it's both primarily to make sure that the patients are safe who are participating in the clinical trial, and also to measure changes in a very accurate way. So the data collected has to be very accurate. So this starts with a funding or agency or sponsor. In the case of clinical trials that are likely going to go to the FDA for approval, it's usually a pharmaceutical company who's funding the study. So they prepare a particular protocol for a particular drug to be studied. It has to get approval from an internal review board of each of the participating medical centers. But there's also a review board, an ethical review board that looks at the protocol and makes sure that there's no undue harm or undue exposure to harm that will happen during the study to any participants. So the pharma will then reach out to multiple medical centers to get them involved. And at each medical center will be site investigator, usually a physician, a neuromuscular specialist, who will have the help of research coordinators. In the case of neuromuscular diseases, because we need really accurate measurement of the outcome measures, we always have very well-trained clinical evaluators. And there's a lot of oversight to what happens at during the clinical trial. And this is, again, to assure that the integrity of the data that we're looking at and to ensure the safety. And it's also very important to have everything documented, because when the company goes to the FDA, you need to have everything documented and all of the data. And it's an estimate that for every drug that's approved, the FDA will look at 100,000 pages of data and reports. So everything has to be checked and double checked, and to ensure that, well, I went ahead of myself a little bit. So of course, you can't have a study without patients, and the patients are recruited at different sites. And then oversight, there's going to be site monitors. These are individuals who are usually employed by the pharmaceutical companies that go regularly to every site, make sure all of the files are well documented, that there's no ambiguity in the data that's being collected. Every T is crossed, every I is dotted. that everything makes sense. And again, they also make sure that every part of the protocol is followed exactly as it was meant to happen. The next level of oversight is the medical monitor. That's usually a physician who's independent from the study, but hired by a pharmaceutical company or the PI to basically be to oversee what's going on at the different sites, mostly to make sure that if there are side effects that they are dealt with appropriately, and if there are severe side effects, that the FDA is informed about that. And so the medical monitor job is very important to ensure the safety of the study participants. And the medical monitor reports to the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. And so this is a collection of physicians, data management folks, and a statistician who look at the data regularly during the study to ensure that there are no safety concerns. When they look at the data, they look at it without knowing. So they will look at two group data, but they will not know which of the groups are getting active drug or placebo. But if there is a difference between the two groups in side effects, for example, then they will inquire further and make some recommendations. Or if there's a clear difference between the two groups in the way they're responding to medications, for example, one group that ends up to be the one on active drug that's doing much better than placebo, they may choose to end the study because it's very clear that the drug is working, and it becomes unethical to continue giving patients placebo at that point. So any of you who've been in clinical trials will know that there are different phases of clinical trials. And so I'll talk about the different phases of clinical trials and what they mean. Again, we start with preclinical research. And when you go from the lab to humans, you start with a phase 1 study. And a phase 1 study is to establish a drug safety in normal volunteers, so unaffected individuals. So phase 1 studies are done in drugs that have never been tested in humans. You want to first make sure that there are no major safety concerns when you test the drug in unaffected individuals, normal volunteers who don't have any major medical problems. And this is usually a fairly short study. Probably 10 or 20 volunteers are usually enough to get a lot of data regarding the drug safety. The next phase is phase 2 study, which is, again, to put it in context, the current Fulcrum study is a phase 2 study. They were able to jump to kind of, they could have gone to phase 2 without a phase 1. They actually did some a normal volunteer study just to make sure that to make sure that the drug is safe. But they started very quickly into a phase 2 study. And this phase, it's fairly short, several months to a year usually. And you're checking efficacy and you're checking for side effects in the patient population. And again, it's usually double-blind and randomized. So it's usually divided 50-50 among patients who are taking the active drug versus the placebo. And again, the objective of phase 2 study is to get an inkling or at least early indications of improvement. They don't need to necessarily show that somebody is stronger, but if there are other indications using what we talked about, the biomarkers, that things are moving in the right direction. If your biomarker is looking at the expression of DUX4 in muscle, for example, if you can show that the drug has shut off the production of DUX4 in muscle, even if you didn't see any improvement in patients, then this is enough of an incentive to go to a phase 3 study, which is a large placebo-controlled study that usually a year or longer. And again, depending on the disease that you're looking at, can be 100 to 150 to several thousand patients in case of very common disease like diabetes, for example. And again, this is really this is the phase that is the most important for application to the FDA for approval. You have to show in a phase 3 study that your drug is not only safe, but it does result in significant improvement in patients who are on the active drug. And from phase 3, you go into the FDA review, and then there's what we call a phase 4 study, which is the post-marketing survey. If the FDA review is positive and the drug is marketed, the FDA still needs to know that patients who are on the drug over long term don't have any long-term safety issues with it. So oftentimes the pharmaceutical companies who's providing the drug will be involved in the post-marketing survey. So this is the process, and most new drugs don't make it past phase 1. So the fact that we have a phase 2 study going on in FSH muscular dystrophy is very encouraging at this point. So this is taken from the NIH website, but modified a little bit to specifically target neuromuscular diseases. So what do you need to ask before entering a clinical trial? These are things that, patients are usually very anxious and eager to get into a clinical trial. And so sometimes you oversee your enthusiasm, makes you not necessarily very objective in asking some important questions. And so these are things that are important for you to ask before entering into clinical trial, because this is a commitment of time. Again, for a phase 2 trial, it can be several months, but it can be over a year in case of a phase 3 trial. So you have to ask, why do researchers believe that the drug will be effective? This is something that you can address. You can talk to the site investigator. Has it been tested before? You want to know the safety profile. What are the known side effects of the drug? Again, if it's a completely new drug, the investigators may know some side effects, but probably not all of the side effects. What possible treatments I might receive? Again, we talked about that. It's going to be in a phase 2 or phase 3 study. It's going to be placebo or active drug. Or sometimes if there's a trial where they're not uncertain about the dose, it could be placebo plus active drug at 2 different doses. So in effect, there'll be 3 groups instead of 2 groups. Or it could be active drug against existing approved drug for that condition, which again, this is not applicable for FSH at this point. Who will know what treatment I'm on? So the treatment is usually kept, basically everybody who has direct contact with the patients is blinded to what they're taking. The patient doesn't know, the physician, the site investigator doesn't know, the coordinator doesn't know. The only person who has the list of what everyone is taking is usually the pharmacist. And there are instances where there's a need to actually break the blind in case somebody has a major side effect, and treatment of that side effect may have, if you don't know if the patient is on treatment or not, it's important to know what treatment they are on so that the physicians can address the side effect, and the blind is broken for that particular patient. And you need to know what tests and procedures are being involved. Some procedures may be invasive. I mean, is there going to be a muscle biopsy? Is there going to be other invasive procedures other than just taking a blood sample? Is there going to be EMG testing or anything of the sort? You have to know what you're getting into. You need to know how long the study will last, how many visits will you have, how long the visits are to the research center. These are all important issues. If you're somebody who has a day job, of course, I mean, this is going to impact on what you do and how you plan your involvement with the study. And even, consider if it is even feasible, depending on how many visits there are and how long the visits will be. Will I be reimbursed for other expenses? Yes, usually, drug companies will pay for travel expenses, and if patients are coming from a distance, or mileage if they're coming from short distances. If there are studies that may require an overnight stay, any lodging expenses and meal expenses will be covered as well. If I benefit from the intervention, will I be allowed to continue receiving it after the trial ends? And that's a very legitimate question, and oftentimes, and this is something that people have to know. For example, if you're in a phase 2 study, if the phase 2 study ends and the company is going for a phase 3 study, you're not going to be eligible for that phase 3 study. But what happens often is that if a situation like that happens, if you're in a phase 2 study and the drug company is interested in going to phase 3 study, meaning that they've had some indication of a positive effect, then they will offer all of the patients who are in the phase 2 study what we call an open label extension of the study. So everybody will be getting active drug and will be followed intermittently after the phase 2 study is done. So it's no longer a double-blinded study, but it is still a study that will help the company understand what happens over a long period of time when patients take active drug. Of course, that will have to stop. For example, if the phase 3 trial proves negative for that particular drug. Will the results of the study be provided to me? Usually the study results are provided in group data. I mean, these are the published studies. Sometimes you'll be able to get information about what you were randomized to, whether you had actually active drug or not. Who will oversee my medical care while I'm participating in a trial? So again, any clinical trial, at every visit, there'll be very close medical supervision. There'll be blood tests to make sure that there are no side effects. But the day-to-day care will have to be by your primary care physician or any specialist that you follow, or your primary neurologist that you go see. And again, if there are issues, medical issues that pop up that has to do with that possibly have to do with the trial, then your primary care physician can contact the site investigator and they will try to work things out as to what needs to be done. And again, in extreme circumstances when unblinding what this person is taking is going to be important in their treatment, then that will happen as well, because the safety of the patients and of all trial participants is very important. What are my options if I'm injured during the study? Usually, again, if you have insurance company, your insurance company will cover any treatments that are potentially the result of you participating in the clinical trial. But oftentimes as well, if whatever is not covered by your primary care company will be covered by the sponsoring, the study sponsors. Okay, so over time, and I've been doing this for a long time, consent forms 20 years ago used to be 1 page. And they have you sign, they give you very minimal details. Now the consent forms are very lengthy. They can be 20 pages long. And you know, somebody who wants to participate in the study will just skip that and just sign. But I really urge everybody to read it, make sure you know what you're getting into. The consent form should have enough detail to let you know exactly what you're committing to over that period of time. And so take the time to read it and ask questions before you go home after the first visit. And remember that participation is voluntary. You can leave anytime. You're not obligated to stay in the study. You know, obviously, if there are side effects that are intolerable in your situation, then you stop the study. In general, we like to keep seeing patients even if they're no longer taking the drug or placebo. This is important data for us to collect, but we understand when somebody is not able to do that. And again, kind of to reiterate, you can quit anytime and for whatever reason. Okay, and this is what we talked about. Again, if there are remaining visits that are scheduled, we would like patients to come back and do that so we can track them and see what happens to them over time. This provides valuable information for the study, even if you're not on taking the drug or placebo. So that's the FDA approval of new drugs is kind of an important process. And this is always a point of concern for patients, for us as well. We want to try to get drugs out as rapidly as possible, but the FDA has to do its due diligence and make sure that a drug is really effective and that there are no major side effects. So what does the FDA require to approve a new drug? So generally, they require at least 1 phase 3 study that's effective, oftentimes 2 phase 3 studies. Again, this is very negotiable depending on the disease you're talking about. If this is a disease that has unmet needs, meaning a disease that does not have an approved drug, that level of evidence is not necessary. And the FDA actually has taken into consideration the rare diseases and the diseases that have unmet needs and has simplified and accelerated the process of approval for these drugs. And we've seen some examples of that in neuromuscular diseases in the last couple of years. Okay, so, and again, for rare diseases, again, one of the issues with rare diseases is drug companies may not want to get into that field because the number of patients are very small, and the commercial incentives are not there. So the FDA provides what's called orphan drug designation. For rare disease, the FDA provides financial incentives to get pharma to enter the rare disease field. But the FDA has done other things as well. So rare diseases defined as diseases with less than 200,000 affected individuals in the US, and FSH clearly meets that criteria. And again, there are other incentives to accelerate a drug approval process for diseases of unmet needs, and I'll talk about those next. And those may be a little bit, this is more for the pharma, but just to show you that the FDA has several things that they do to kind of accelerate drug approval for rare diseases. The fast track, which is a process designated to facilitate the development and expedite the review of drugs to treat serious illnesses and those with unmet needs. And so they will prioritize drugs that are treating something like FSH over a new drug for a condition that already has approved drugs. If it's a breakthrough therapy, they'll also expedite the development of and review of the drugs made in again, something that has substantial response to in the patient population that you're looking at. There's accelerated approval also. These regulations allow drug for serious conditions with unmet needs to be approved based on what we call surrogate endpoint. Surrogate endpoints are things that, for example, a surrogate endpoint is something that you can measure for example, in muscle diseases. What you like to see is somebody getting stronger, but a surrogate measure of that may be a change on the MRI in the muscle that may indicate improvement, or increase in the volume of that muscle that may indicate improvement. Usually for more common diseases, the FDA will not use a surrogate endpoint as a measure of efficacy. They want to see improvement in strength in the case of muscle diseases. But for rare diseases, they will take a surrogate endpoint that is very convincing and move the drug into approval, a rapid approval process. And again, priority review is the other thing that they do. They promise a 6-month turnaround for applications for drug approval for diseases with unmet needs and in orphan diseases. And I'm going to stop here and happy to take questions.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Dr. Tawil. We had some questions that were submitted in advance to us online, so I'll start with some of those. So typically when a clinical trial is posted on clinicaltrials.gov, they will mention that the age of the participant is restricted. Usually someone has to be 18 years old. And then there might be an upper limit. Someone might be, have to be no older than 60 years old, for example, or 65. And patients want to know why. They say, I'm still doing well at 65. I'm ready to volunteer. So can you explain why there are age restrictions?
Yeah, so I mean, there are entry criteria for any study. And again, when you're doing an early study, you want to make sure that you pick a population that you think is the one that's going to show response to a treatment that you have. So, for example, in the case of muscular dystrophy, you want to take somebody who's mildly to moderately affected. You don't want somebody who has minimal involvement or somebody who's very severely affected, because you may not see a change in either of those patients over a short period of time. The upper limit is usually concerns about the upper age limit is because of concerns about as we age, we have more systemic diseases, cardiac diseases, for example, and we're more susceptible to side effects. And so, again, in an early phase study, they might set an upper limit because of that, because they're looking at side effects, and they want to make sure that they're picking patients who are less likely to get severe side effects, so that they know what the profile is before widening the age group. The lower limit is a function of, in particular for FSH, we all know that there are early onset FSH muscular dystrophy, but these are few in numbers overall. About 5% of individuals, even though a lot of patients present in the second decade of life, late teens, early 20s, but they quickly go past the 18, and it's easier to get approval for a drug in the adult population than in the pediatric population. For the pediatric population, there are additional concerns about safety that have to be taken into consideration. So oftentimes you start with an adult group, again, with an age limitation and severity limitation that you'd expect are not going to get into trouble initially from side effects. And then as you see what happens in the initial study, you can expand the age group and the severity of involvement.
Oh, thank you very much. We have a question from someone who said you had mentioned the kinds of numbers of patients who are needed in phase 1 and phase 3. What are the numbers that might typically be needed for a phase 2 trial for FSHD?
It really depends on, a lot of that has to do with statistics and has to do with how sensitive our measurements are. If you have, and what do you expect from the drug? If you think that your drug is going to make everyone 50% better in strength over a 3-month period, then you're going to need very few patients. But the smaller the change that you expect, the bigger the number that you need to show that change.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes. We have a question asking if a phase 2 trial is successful. I'm not sure what that would mean. I guess the data indicated it should move forward to the next phase. Do you think the things like age restrictions would be loosened for a phase 3 trial?
Usually. Well, I don't, it can, again, depending on the age is, the issue is, has there been trials with this medication in a younger population? So, which is kind of a different. So the criteria for the upper age limit and maybe it's the severity of involvement can be loosened up. But again, the 18 age group is, and again, it has to do with not only the children, anybody below the age of 18, but younger children even more. They're more susceptible to certain medications, but also they are not adults to be consenting on their own. So there has to be a special consenting process and a different level of approval than something that we do for adults. And again, the question is, I know this is a question that comes up very frequently, especially because kids with FSH can be more severely affected. It also has to do with numbers, and it's very difficult. And we already know from some of the natural history studies that have been done on younger aged FSH patients, children, it's difficult to be able to recruit enough numbers to go into a clinical trial. But but in general, even if that does not happen, you know, I think the drug approval process, if a drug is approved, then there will be an easier process to take that into children.
So I have a question here from someone who says they had cancer in the past and seems that I am not eligible for any drug studies. Since we have a relatively small population, is it possible for these types of restrictions to be lifted?
Again, it depends on the drug, and it depends on whether somebody has active. I mean, if somebody has a cancer and this has been treated and they're in remission, in most instances, they should be able to participate in the study unless there's a concern that the drug that is being tested may be carcinogenic in any way. And again, I mean, these inclusion criteria are really very dependent on what is being used as far as treatment. So that's going to vary a lot between the different drugs.
I have a question asking if the consent form items are negotiable, or are they not, you know, is it a take it or leave it?
They're not negotiable because, I mean, if they were, we will have not a complete set of data on everybody, or different things, different, if it's a menu list, you won't get enough data on any particular thing that makes sense over time. It is a limitation. We understand that, but again, for example, you know, you may opt not to do a muscle biopsy, or you don't want to do a muscle biopsy. Muscle biopsy in a phase 2 is going to be very important in a particular setting, such as the Fulcrum study, but may not be required in a phase 3 study.
We have a question from a patient asking if they are registered to be contacted. I suppose that could mean they are in the national registry, or maybe they are already a patient in a clinic where there's going to be a clinical trial. Will we be proactively contacted by the trial site, or do we need to, as a patient, reach out to the trial?
I think everybody should be reaching out. I mean, let me just give you an example. I mean, you know, every site, especially a site that has a lot of patients with FSH, it's just not feasible for us to contact everybody all at once. And again, I mean, that's why there's the clinicaltrials.gov, the FSH Society website, to, you know, see if there's something going on. You can always call your site. Smaller sites who have small number of patients may contact all of them at the same time. We also, I mean, that, you know, the reality is we can't get everybody into a clinical trial at any time, especially when it's a small trial like a phase 2 study, and there are competing sites that are doing it. It's a difficult thing, but we wish we could, you know, recruit as many patients as possible for every study. And again, you have to be your own advocate. So you have to call the sites, be aware of what's going on actively. With regards to the national registry will not contact patients unless, again, I mean, there are multiple, I won't go over that now. I mean, there are multiple useful things about the registry that has helped us understand FSH much better than we did before the registry, but the registry does not share data with anybody about individual patients except in an anonymized way. And if a company comes to the registry and says, we want to recruit patients with FSH with those characteristics, then the registry will inform those individuals who fit those criteria.
Thank you. And I should mention the FSHD Society also maintains what we call a contact registry for research studies. So we work with the studies coordinators. If they need volunteers, they will reach out to us and we will send email to patients in the area of that study. So that's why we keep drumming home the importance of making sure the society has your email address and that you are reading your emails. I know that we all get too many emails and it's easy to ignore them, but we send them out with, you know, important notices about studies that are looking for volunteers. So we have a question here about asking why there hasn't been any clinical trial of anabolic steroids, which I think many, you know, some individuals may be using to kind of self-treat and feel that it's an effective intervention for them.
So there is a trial ongoing at the University of Rochester with anabolic steroids. Again, I think using testosterone and growth hormone. Personally, I think these are potentially stopgap measures, but it's not a long-term treatment because these medications have a lot of side effects. They're not applicable to female patients. So, and you really, at a time when we know what the cause of FSH is, we really have to go towards targeted treatments and not just non-specific anabolic agents, because they really do have a lot of side effects. Anabolic agents that are specific for muscle and don't have any systemic side effects like the myostatin inhibitors have been tried and so far have not worked very well, such as in the Acceleron study.
I have a question from an individual asking, does weight loss by a patient who's participating in the Resolve study, would that affect the accuracy or validity of the data collected?
It depends what the weight loss is from. Most of what we tell patients in the Resolve study is that, we don't want to discourage people from becoming physically active, but we want them, at least during the study, if they're very active physically, to continue doing that. If they're not so, just keep doing what you're doing so that there's not another factor that influences the measurement of strength.
We have a question asking how many trials are currently running or being planned for FSHD?
There's one trial running now. The Acceleron has ended. There is the anabolic steroid one that's going on in Rochester. Again, these are all should be on clinicaltrials.gov. I don't know of any other trials that are about to start, and I think it's going to be probably another year or two before we see another company come with a new medication.
Although I do want to mention you referred to the Resolve study early in your talk, and that is a kind of trial. It's an observational trial,
yeah.
But very important.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Joan. So again, as I showed in my slides, the observational studies that is really critical now, and that's why a lot of companies have come to us to ask us to expand the number of patients that we're studying, and by the end of, hopefully we're going to have at the end of the study 300 patients who've been followed for 18 months. That's going to be very valuable information. The other, I think, benefit that people get from participating in observational studies is that you're going to be able to ask me every time you come to visit, what's going on, doc? What's out there? Are there new trials? And you'll be, if you're participating in any particular site, you're going to be at the forefront because we've seen you recently. If something comes up that's new, that's applicable to you, that we're going to be, certainly will be calling you.
So I think we have time maybe for one more question or a related set of questions. We have someone in Vancouver asking, is there a way to establish a clinical trial site in Vancouver? And we've been asked basically the same question from patients all over the country and all over the world. So can you explain what it takes to establish, a clinical trial site? Why are there, 20 sites that were picked and not other sites? And
yeah. So, I mean, a pharmaceutical company, for example, will go out and vet different sites. They will go to sites that have done work in FSH first, and have, because those are the sites who've accumulated a lot of patients who they're following, and sites that have the infrastructure to do clinical trials in neuromuscular diseases, have trained evaluators, know how to do certain procedures. All of those things have to be vetted up front. And also that particular site has access to enough patients that they can call to, in order to contribute to the clinical trial. So there are 2 sites in Canada, probably the person from Vancouver knows, in Ottawa and in Montreal. But eventually, I mean, the decision is made by the drug company. And again, I know people are very excited by this phase 2 study, but the next phase study is going to be much bigger, and it's going to include many more patients, and it's going to include many more sites as well.
So one thing we often mention to patients is FSHD is a condition where very often people have experience of being diagnosed and told, well, there's no intervention, go live your life, and the patient never returns to the neuromuscular clinic. And we feel it's important for people to have an annual assessment, even if for years it might just be saying you're fine, you're stable. Well, this is great news. It's also good to know. But if a neuromuscular center, has, let's say they're doing many trials for other things, ALS and Duchenne and so on, but they don't have a big list of FSHD patients who are actively being seen in clinic, they will not likely get on the radar as a potential trial site. So this is a time both for your own health and your care to maybe go be seen at the type of clinics that are capable of running trials. And we, it's no guarantee that it will become a site, but it will have a much better chance of becoming a future clinical trial site if patients in the region start showing up for, would you, Dr. Tawil, do you think that's a reasonable?
Absolutely. And again, June, you've been very active in trying to create local chapters. Again, access to patients is important. And I know I've been doing this for a long time, so we've seen a lot of patients here in Rochester, but a lot of sites have not. And because there have not been any trials until recently, patients who are not very affected kind of stayed away. And it's time to kind of, show up and make yourself, come and see that your neurologist and make sure you know what's going on. This is the best way to remain active in your own, for your own benefit in the long run. And again, I think the more you are participating in an annual visit, which I agree with June should be something that everybody with FSH should do, even just to come and say, I'm fine, just to know what's going on, and to stay on top of things if you're interested in trials.
Well, we are at the end of the hour, so I want to thank you so much for your time. This was an extremely informative and timely topic. So thank you very much. And next year we'll have another series of webinars, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Tawil.
Thank you. Bye.